I was scrubbing vomit off the men's bathroom floor when Lieutenant Commander Peterson walked in, took one look at me on my hands and knees, and said the words that would change everything. "Riley, pack your gear. You're coming with us to Afghanistan." The other officers behind him started laughing, thinking it was some kind of joke. After all, who takes a janitor on a Navy SEAL mission? But Peterson wasn't laughing. He was dead serious, and in that moment, I knew my carefully constructed cover was about to be blown wide open. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I continued mopping, pretending I hadn't heard him. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it echoing off the tile walls. For 3 years, I had perfected the art of invisibility. 3 years of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated like furniture. 3 years of cleaning up after the very people I once commanded. But Peterson knew. Somehow, he knew who I really was. I had arrived at Naval Base Point Loma on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a carefully forged employment record. The base personnel office barely looked up when I applied for the janitorial position. Sarah Chen, they wrote on my name tag, as if reducing me to 2 words could somehow make the transformation complete. Sarah Chen, janitor. Not Commander Sarah Chen, Navy SEAL Team 6, with 14 years of distinguished service and more classified missions than I could count on both hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who had broken barriers that most people didn't even know existed, reduced to scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans for men who would have saluted me just 4 years earlier. But that was before everything went wrong. Before the mission in Syria that was supposed to be routine turned into a nightmare that haunted my sleep. Before the investigation that cleared me of all wrongdoing but destroyed my reputation anyway. Before my own commanding officer, a man I had trusted with my life countless times, decided that having a female SEAL was more trouble than it was worth, and found a way to push me out. The official story was that I had requested a medical discharge due to post-traumatic stress. The unofficial story, the one whispered in corridors and mess halls, was that I had cracked under pressure during a critical operation and gotten good people killed. Neither story was true, but the truth didn't matter when it came to protecting the Navy's image and the careers of men who wore more stars on their shoulders than I ever would. So I disappeared, changed my name, dyed my black hair blonde, traded my combat boots for rubber gloves, and found work in the one place where no one would think to look for a former Navy SEAL. I became invisible in plain sight, just another member of the cleaning crew that people walked past without a second glance. The cruel beauty of it was perfect. While the Navy spent months trying to track down Sarah Chen to ensure my silence about classified operations, I was mopping their floors and emptying their wastebaskets, hearing every conversation they thought was private. My first day at Point Loma, I had been assigned to Building 7, which housed the administrative offices and briefing rooms for several SEAL teams. The base security officer, a stocky man named Martinez, had walked me through the building with all the enthusiasm of someone giving directions to a public restroom. "You clean the offices after hours," he had said, his voice suggesting this was the most obvious thing in the world. "You don't touch any documents, you don't listen to conversations, and you definitely don't talk to anyone unless they ask you a direct question. These guys value their privacy." If only he knew how much I valued their conversations. In my first week alone, I learned more about current SEAL operations than most Pentagon officials. The teams talked freely around me, discussing missions, personnel changes, and strategic planning as if I were a piece of furniture. It was fascinating and heartbreaking in equal measure, listening to my former colleagues plan operations, using tactics I had helped develop, preparing for the kind of missions that had once defined my entire existence. Lieutenant Jackson was the worst. A young officer, probably fresh out of naval special warfare training, who treated me like his personal servant. He would drop candy wrappers on the floor, just after I had finished vacuuming, leave coffee stains on his desk deliberately, and once actually snapped his fingers at me to get my attention. "Hey cleaning lady," he had called out during a team meeting I was trying to clean around quietly. "Can you come back later? We're discussing important things here." Important things. If he only knew that I had more combat experience than his entire team combined. That I had been conducting special operations when he was still in high school, that the important things they were discussing were based on protocols I had helped write. But I had smiled politely, apologized for the interruption, and wheeled my cart out of the room, like the good little janitor I was supposed to be. The hardest part wasn't the disrespect or the demeaning work. It was the isolation. I was surrounded by people who spoke my language, who understood the world I came from, but I couldn't connect with any of them. I ate lunch alone in the janitor's break room, a windowless closet barely large enough for a table and 2 chairs. I lived alone in a tiny apartment off base, paying rent with money earned by cleaning the workspaces of people who used to be my peers. I had gone from leading teams of elite warriors to having conversations only with my reflection in the bathroom mirror I cleaned every morning. The other janitors were kind enough, but we had nothing in common beyond our work uniforms. Maria had been cleaning government buildings for 15 years and spoke mostly Spanish, which I understood but couldn't speak fluently. Tom was a Vietnam veteran who spent his breaks talking about his grandchildren and complaining about his arthritis. They accepted me as part of their small crew, but they could never understand the life I had left behind, or the reasons I couldn't go back to it. Sleep became my enemy. Every night, I would lie in my narrow bed and stare at the ceiling, replaying missions from my previous life. The successful ones, where everything went according to plan and everyone came home safe. The difficult ones, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. And always, inevitably, the last one. The mission that ended everything. We had been tasked with extracting a high-value asset from a compound in eastern Syria. Intelligence indicated minimal resistance, a quick in-and-out operation that should have taken less than 2 hours from insertion to extraction. I was team leader, responsible for 8 other SEALs, including 3 men I had worked with for over 2 years. We knew each other's moves, trusted each other's judgment, operated like a single organism with 9 parts. The intelligence was wrong, not unusual in our line of work, but this time the consequences were catastrophic. Instead of minimal resistance, we walked into a carefully planned ambush. Instead of a routine extraction, we found ourselves pinned down in a firefight that lasted 7 hours. Instead of everyone coming home, we lost 2 good men and barely escaped with our lives. The investigation that followed was thorough and professional. Military tribunals are surprisingly fair when they want to be, and the evidence clearly showed that I had made the best decisions possible with the information available. No one questioned my tactical choices, my leadership during the firefight, or my efforts to minimize casualties. The official report stated that the mission failure was due to faulty intelligence, not operational errors. But official reports don't control public opinion, especially when that public consists of military personnel, who have their own opinions about women in combat roles. The whispers started immediately. Maybe she froze when the shooting started. Maybe she panicked and made poor decisions. Maybe having a woman in charge compromised the team's effectiveness. Maybe those 2 men would still be alive if a real SEAL had been leading the mission. I never heard these whispers directly, of course. No one was brave enough to say such things to my face. But I felt them in the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. I saw them in the careful distance my colleagues maintained, the sudden formality of people who had once been friends. I experienced them in the way my next mission assignments became routine and low risk, the military equivalent of being put on light duty. Commander Harrison, my immediate superior, and a man I had respected for 6 years, called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon in March. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, or attempt to soften what he had to say. "Chen," he had said, not meeting my eyes, "I think it's time we discussed your future options." Future options? Military speak for "we want you gone." He went on to explain that while my service record was exemplary and the investigation had cleared me of any wrongdoing, there were concerns about team cohesion and operational effectiveness. He used phrases like "fresh start" and "new opportunities," and "what's best for everyone involved." What he meant was that having a female SEAL who had lost men was bad for morale and worse for public relations. The offer was generous, considering they simply wanted me to disappear. Full medical discharge with benefits, positive letters of recommendation, and a promise that my service record would remain exemplary. All I had to do was admit to psychological trauma from the Syria mission, accept that I was no longer fit for special operations duty, and quietly fade away from the Navy SEAL community forever. I could have fought it, could have demanded a formal hearing, brought legal action, made noise about discrimination and unfair treatment. But what would have been the point? Even if I won, even if I forced them to keep me, I would always be the female SEAL who had to sue to stay. Every mission would be scrutinized, every decision questioned, every failure attributed to the fact that I was a woman who didn't belong. So I took the deal, signed the papers, packed my belongings, and walked away from the only life I had ever wanted. But I couldn't stay away completely. The military was all I knew, the only world that made sense to me. Working at Point Loma wasn't just a job, it was a way to remain connected to the community that had rejected me, even if that connection was through a mop bucket and a toilet brush. The work itself wasn't difficult, just soul-crushing in its monotony. I developed routines that allowed my mind to wander while my hands went through the motions. Vacuum the offices first, dust the furniture, empty the waste baskets, clean the bathrooms last. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, of mindless repetition that left me exhausted in ways that special operations training never had. But I learned things. Information has a way of revealing itself when people don't think anyone important is listening. I learned about operational planning failures, budget constraints that compromised mission effectiveness, and personnel decisions that prioritized politics over competence. I learned which officers were respected by their men, and which ones were privately mocked. I learned about security vulnerabilities, training deficiencies, and equipment problems that the official reports would never acknowledge. Most importantly, I learned about the current state of naval special operations from the perspective of someone who had helped shape it. The SEALs I observed were good, well-trained and dedicated, but they lacked the experience and institutional knowledge that comes from years of real-world operations. Too many of the senior personnel had been promoted based on administrative skills, rather than operational competence. Too many of the tactical decisions were being made by people who had never been shot at. I kept detailed mental notes, telling myself that someday this information might be useful.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Maybe I would write a book, or consult for defense contractors, or find some other way to contribute to military effectiveness without actually serving. But mostly, I just observed and remembered, because that was all I had left of my former life. The closest I came to being discovered was during my second month at Point Loma. I was cleaning the briefing room after a team meeting when I noticed that Lieutenant Morrison had left classified documents on the conference table. Standard protocol required that all classified materials be secured immediately after any meeting, but Morrison was young and careless. The documents contained operational plans for a mission in West Africa, including detailed intelligence that looked suspiciously similar to information I had worked with 3 years earlier. I should have simply reported the security violation to the duty officer and moved on with my cleaning. But the intelligence was wrong, not just incomplete or outdated, but fundamentally incorrect in ways that could get people killed. The compound layout was different from what the documents showed, the local force strength was significantly underestimated, and the extraction plan relied on helicopter support that might not be available due to seasonal weather patterns. I stood there for 10 minutes staring at those documents and wrestling with my conscience. I had sworn an oath to protect my fellow service members, but I was no longer in a position to honor that oath directly. I could report the security violation, but that wouldn't fix the bad intelligence. I could try to contact someone with the authority to correct the information, but that would require revealing how I knew it was wrong. In the end, I did nothing. I finished cleaning the room and left the documents exactly where I had found them. 2 weeks later, I read in the base newsletter that the West Africa mission had been postponed indefinitely due to evolving intelligence requirements. Someone else had noticed the problems with the operational plan, probably someone with the authority to do something about it. But I had lost sleep for those 2 weeks, wondering if my silence had put people at risk. That was when I realized how completely my exile had separated me from my true calling. I wasn't just physically removed from special operations, I was ethically isolated from the responsibility I had once embraced. I could see problems, identify solutions, and possess knowledge that could save lives, but I had no way to act on any of it. I was a ghost haunting the edges of the world I used to inhabit, invisible and powerless to influence anything that mattered. The other cleaning staff began to worry about me. Maria would bring extra sandwiches to work and insist I eat lunch with her, chattering in rapid Spanish about her daughter's wedding plans or her son's troubles in school. Tom would corner me during breaks and tell elaborate stories about his fishing expeditions, clearly trying to draw me out of whatever shell he thought I had crawled into. They meant well, but their kindness only emphasized how alone I really was. I started staying late after my shift ended, using my access card to wander through empty buildings and remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. The base was different at night, quieter and somehow more honest. Without the bustle of daily operations, I could imagine myself back in uniform, walking these corridors with purpose instead of pushing a mop cart. It was during one of these late-night wanderings that I first encountered Lieutenant Commander Peterson. I was in Building 7, ostensibly doing extra cleaning in the briefing rooms, when I heard footsteps in the corridor. I quickly grabbed my cleaning supplies and pretended to be working, but when Peterson appeared in the doorway, he didn't seem surprised to find me there. "Working late tonight, Sarah," he said, and something in his tone made me look up from the table I was wiping down. Peterson was different from the other officers I encountered during my cleaning duties. Older, more experienced, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of real combat operations. His uniform bore the decorations of someone who had earned his rank through competence rather than politics, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a professional who missed nothing. "Just catching up on some extra work, sir," I replied, keeping my voice neutral and my eyes focused on my cleaning cloth. "Sarah Chen," he said thoughtfully, as if testing the name. "Interesting choice." My hands stilled on the table surface, but I forced myself to continue wiping in slow, steady circles. "I'm sorry, sir, Sarah Chen," he repeated. Common name, easy to remember, easy to forget, perfect for someone who wants to blend in. The building was completely silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of my own heartbeat. I could feel Peterson studying me, but I didn't dare look up to meet his gaze. After what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, he spoke again. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a corner of the table where there was no spot to miss. "Thank you, sir," I replied, moving my cloth to the indicated area. He watched me work for another minute, then turned and walked away without another word. But something had changed in that brief encounter. Peterson hadn't been making conversation with the cleaning lady, he had been evaluating someone he suspected might be more than she appeared. I finished my cleaning and left the building as quickly as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my careful anonymity was beginning to crack. Peterson had looked at me the way officers looked at personnel under their command, not the way they looked at invisible support staff. He had spoken my name like he was testing it against some other name he might know. The next few days passed without incident, but I found myself constantly aware of Peterson's presence on the base. I would see him in corridors, catch glimpses of him through office windows, notice him observing training exercises from a distance. He never spoke to me again, never even seemed to notice me, but I had the persistent feeling that I was being watched. It was Tom who told me about Peterson's reputation. We were having lunch in our windowless break room when he mentioned seeing the commander talking to the base CO earlier that morning. "That's one hell of an officer," Tom said, unwrapping his bologna sandwich with the care of someone performing a sacred ritual. "Peterson, been everywhere, done everything. Word is he's here to evaluate training protocols, maybe shake up some of the teams. What makes him so special?" I asked, trying to sound casually interested. Tom leaned forward conspiratorially, clearly delighted to share what he knew. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, classified missions all over the Middle East and Africa. Lost part of his left hand to an IED in 2018 but refused medical retirement. They say he's been pushing for changes in how SEALs are selected and trained, thinks too many good people are being wasted. Good people being wasted. The phrase stuck with me for the rest of the day. I found myself wondering what Peterson knew about waste in the SEAL community, whether his evaluation of training protocols extended to personnel decisions that pushed experienced operators out of the service. That evening, I made a decision that would prove to be either brilliant or catastrophic. Instead of going home after my shift, I returned to Building 7 and used my access card to enter Peterson's temporary office. I wasn't planning to steal anything or plant surveillance equipment. I just wanted to understand who he was and what he was doing at Point Loma. His office was Spartan, functional, containing only the basic furniture and equipment provided to temporary personnel. But the documents on his desk told a fascinating story. Peterson wasn't just evaluating training protocols, he was conducting a comprehensive review of personnel management practices within the Naval Special Operations community. His files contained detailed analyses of recruitment, selection, training, and retention rates going back 5 years. More interestingly, he had been tracking what the Navy euphemistically called voluntary separations. Officers and enlisted personnel who had left the service before completing their full career obligations, often citing personal reasons or medical issues that couldn't be independently verified. The numbers were startling. In the past 3 years, the SEALs had lost nearly 30% of their most experienced personnel to voluntary separations. I was studying these statistics when I heard footsteps in the corridor. There was nowhere to hide, no plausible reason for me to be in Peterson's office after hours, and no time to return the documents to their original positions. I was caught, and we both knew it when Peterson appeared in the doorway. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, closing the door behind him. I stood up slowly, my hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Sir, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," Peterson said, moving to his desk and calmly gathering up the documents I had been reading. "The question is whether you'll tell me the truth or continue with this cleaning lady performance." He knew, somehow, despite all my precautions and careful anonymity, Peterson had figured out who I was. I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified, like a fugitive who was grateful to finally be caught but terrified of the consequences. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. Peterson settled into his desk chair and gestured for me to sit across from him. "I suspected from the first night I saw you here. Sarah Chen might be a perfectly common name, but the woman wearing it moves like someone with advanced military training. Your situational awareness is too good, your physical conditioning too obvious, your understanding of base security protocols too complete for someone who's supposed to be civilian contract labor." He opened one of his files and pulled out a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was my official Navy portrait, taken 6 years ago when I was promoted to Lieutenant Commander. I was in dress uniform, looking directly at the camera with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Commander Sarah Chen," Peterson said, comparing the photograph to my face. "Navy SEAL Team 6, 14 years of distinguished service, multiple classified deployments, Bronze Star with Valor Device, Purple Heart, Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V. Medically discharged 4 years ago, following a mission in Syria that resulted in 2 KIA. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of my former identity settling back onto my shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome uniform. "How did you find me?" "I didn't find you," Peterson replied. "I've been looking for you." The admission hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been actively searching for me, trying to track me down despite the new identity I had constructed so carefully. My first instinct was panic, followed immediately by anger. I had fulfilled my part of the separation agreement, disappeared quietly, and caused no trouble for anyone. What could they possibly want from me now? "Why?" I asked. Peterson leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity I had once used to evaluate enemy positions. "Because the Navy made a mistake when they let you go. Because we're losing people we can't afford to lose. Because I've spent the past year reviewing personnel files and interviewing former team members, and your name comes up in every conversation about operational effectiveness and leadership competence." He pulled out another file, this one considerably thicker than the first. "Do you know what your former teammates say about you? Martinez calls you the best tactical planner he ever worked with. Thompson says you saved his life twice during the Kandahar operation. Williams told me that losing you was the biggest personnel disaster he's witnessed in 15 years of special operations." The names hit me like punches to the chest. These were men I had served with, fought beside, trusted with my life on dozens of occasions. Hearing that they still spoke positively about me, still valued what we had accomplished together, brought tears to my eyes that I hadn't shed since the day I signed my discharge papers. "That doesn't change what happened in Syria," I said quietly. "No, it doesn't," Peterson agreed. But it puts Syria in context. You've led 37 successful missions over your career. 37 times you brought your people home safe. One mission went wrong due to faulty intelligence, and suddenly that becomes the defining moment of your entire service record. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the urgency of someone trying to convince a reluctant recruit to accept a crucial assignment. We need experienced operators, Sarah. Not just people who can shoot and move and follow orders, but people who can think strategically, adapt tactically, and lead effectively under pressure. You're cleaning toilets while the SEALs are struggling with retention problems and leadership shortages. I shook my head, feeling overwhelmed by emotions I had spent 4 years trying to suppress. Even if that's true, it doesn't matter. I can't go back. Too much has happened. Too many people have made their opinions clear about women in special operations. Things change, Peterson said simply. Policies evolve, attitudes shift, and sometimes old mistakes get corrected. I'm not promising it would be easy, or that everyone would welcome you back with open arms. But I am saying that the Navy needs what you have to offer, and you deserve a chance to serve again if that's what you want. What I wanted. For 4 years I had told myself that what I wanted didn't matter, that I had to accept the reality of my situation and find ways to build a meaningful life outside the military. But sitting in that office, talking to an officer who understood both my capabilities and the injustice of my separation, I realized that I had never stopped wanting to serve. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Peterson smiled for the first time since our conversation began. I'm proposing that you stop pretending to be a janitor and start acting like the Navy SEAL commander you never stopped being. The next morning arrived with the familiar sound of my alarm at 4:30, but nothing else felt familiar. I lay in my narrow bed staring at the water-stained ceiling of my studio apartment, replaying every word of my conversation with Peterson. The weight of possibility pressed down on my chest like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. For 4 years, I had trained myself to expect nothing, want nothing, hope for nothing beyond the simple routine of invisible work and quiet survival. Now Peterson was offering me a chance to reclaim the life I had convinced myself was lost forever. I went through my morning routine mechanically. Instant coffee that tasted like burnt water, a protein bar that claimed to be strawberry flavored but tasted like cardboard, 20 minutes of exercise in the cramped space between my bed and kitchenette. The exercises were different now though. Instead of the basic calisthenics I had been doing to maintain general fitness, I found myself running through combat conditioning drills I hadn't performed in years. My body remembered the movements even when my mind tried to forget them. The drive to the base took me through neighborhoods I had stopped noticing months ago, but today everything seemed sharper, more vivid. The morning joggers looked like potential recruits. The construction workers resembled combat engineers. The police officer directing traffic around a fender bender moved with the precise efficiency of someone trained in crisis management. After 4 years of seeing the world as a civilian, I was unconsciously shifting back into the tactical mindset that had once defined my existence. Building 7 looked different when I badged through security at 6 o'clock. The corridors I had mopped hundreds of times suddenly felt like operational spaces again. The offices where I had emptied waste baskets contained mission-critical information. The briefing rooms where I had dusted furniture were command centers where life and death decisions were made daily. I was still wearing my janitor's uniform, still pushing the same cleaning cart, but something fundamental had shifted in how I perceived my environment. Maria greeted me in the supply closet with her usual cheerful Spanish morning blessing, but she paused mid-sentence when she saw my face. "Sarah Mia, you look different today. Did you sleep at all?" I forced a smile and replied in my broken Spanish that I was fine, just thinking about some personal matters. Maria studied me with the sharp intuition of someone who had raised 6 children and knew when people were lying to her, but she didn't press. Instead, she handed me my usual assignment sheet and squeezed my shoulder gently. "Sometimes thinking too much makes us forget to live," she said in English, her accent thick but her meaning crystal clear. "Whatever is in your head, don't let it steal today from you." Her words followed me as I began my cleaning rounds, starting with the administrative offices on the 2nd floor. These were the spaces where personnel decisions were made, where career paths were determined, where people like me were evaluated and categorized and ultimately discarded. I had cleaned these offices hundreds of times without thinking about their significance, but today I found myself paying attention to the conversations drifting through partially open doors. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was discussing budget allocations with his staff, complaining about the cost of replacing experienced personnel who had left the service voluntarily. Training a new SEAL cost the Navy over $500,000, he was saying, his voice carrying the frustration of someone fighting a losing battle. When we lose someone after 8 or 10 years, we're not just losing their expertise, we're losing our investment in their development. Commander Willis was on a conference call about recruitment challenges, explaining to someone higher up the chain of command why the latest selection class was smaller than expected. The problem isn't finding people who want to be SEALs, she said, tapping her pen against her desk in an anxious rhythm. The problem is finding people who have the right combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and strategic thinking ability. We're getting plenty of athletes and adrenaline junkies, but not enough warriors. Warriors, the word hit me like an electric shock. I had been a warrior once, had lived and breathed and bled for the warrior ethos that defined special operations culture. Somewhere in the transition from commander to janitor, I had forgotten that part of myself, buried it so deeply under layers of civilian disguise that I had almost convinced myself it never existed. I was cleaning the windows in Captain Morrison's office when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. Morrison was briefing 2 junior officers about an upcoming operation in Somalia, describing intelligence requirements and tactical challenges that sounded disturbingly familiar. The target compound, the local political situation, the seasonal weather patterns that would affect helicopter operations. It was all eerily similar to a mission I had planned and executed successfully 3 years before the Syria operation. But they were making mistakes, critical errors in their assessment of local force capabilities, dangerous assumptions about enemy response times, tactical decisions that prioritized speed over security in ways that could get people killed. I found myself gripping my cleaning cloth so tightly that my knuckles went white, fighting the overwhelming urge to turn around and correct their planning. The extraction point should be moved, I whispered to myself, staring blindly at the window I was supposed to be cleaning. They're too close to the main road, too exposed to vehicle-borne attacks. Excuse me, I spun around to find Morrison looking at me with confusion and slight annoyance. I had spoken louder than I intended, and all 3 officers were staring at me like I had suddenly started speaking in tongues. I'm sorry, sir, I said quickly, returning to my window cleaning with exaggerated focus. Just talking to myself. I'll be finished here in just a moment. Morrison exchanged glances with the other officers, and I could feel them evaluating whether to make an issue of the cleaning lady who apparently had opinions about military operations. After a moment, he waved dismissively. Just finish up and move along, he said. We're discussing sensitive matters here. Sensitive matters. If only he knew how sensitive, or how familiar. I completed my cleaning and left the office, but the conversation continued to replay in my mind. They were walking into a trap, just like we had in Syria, and I was the only person in the building who could see it clearly. The rest of my morning passed in a haze of conflicted emotions. Every conversation I overheard, every document I glimpsed, every tactical discussion that reached my ears reminded me of the knowledge and experience I possessed but couldn't use. I was surrounded by people who desperately needed what I had to offer, but I was trapped in a role that made me invisible to them. Lunch break arrived with the relief of a prison sentence ending. I sat in the windowless break room with my usual peanut butter sandwich, but instead of eating, I found myself sketching tactical diagrams on napkins. Alternative extraction routes, better positioning for overwatch elements, improved coordination between ground and air assets. It was muscle memory, the automatic response of a trained planner confronted with operational problems. Tom joined me halfway through my meal, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints reminded him daily of his age. He glanced at my napkin sketches with mild curiosity, but said nothing until he had unwrapped his own lunch and taken his first bite. You know, he said, conversationally, I was thinking about what you said yesterday about missing your old job. I looked up sharply. I didn't remember saying anything about missing my old job, certainly nothing specific enough for Tom to remember and reference. What do you mean? Tom chuckled and pointed at my napkins with his sandwich. Most people doodle flowers or faces when they're thinking. You draw what looks like military tactical diagrams. Either you have a very unusual hobby, or you used to do work that required that kind of thinking. I stared at the napkins, seeing them clearly for the first time. Without realizing it, I had drawn detailed overhead views of compound layouts, complete with guard positions, approach routes, and extraction points. They were good diagrams, professional quality, the kind of work product that would have earned approval from any tactical planning officer. I used to work in logistics, I said weakly, gathering up the napkins and stuffing them into my lunch bag. Supply chain management, route planning, that sort of thing. Tom nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes held a skepticism that made me uncomfortable. Must have been some pretty complicated supply chains, he said. Those diagrams look like something from a military operations center. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The message was brief and unsigned. Building 7, Conference Room C, 1400 hours. Come alone. I showed the phone to Tom, who read the message and raised his eyebrows. Someone wants to meet with you privately, he observed. Any idea who? I had a very good idea who, but I wasn't ready to share that information with anyone, not even Tom.
Peterson had said he wanted me to stop pretending to be a janitor, but I wasn't sure what that meant in practical terms. A private meeting in a conference room suggested he had something specific in mind, something that required discretion and security. The afternoon passed slowly, each minute dragging like an hour. I went through the motions of my cleaning duties, but my mind was focused entirely on the upcoming meeting. What did Peterson want from me? What was he prepared to offer? What would he expect in return? Conference Room C was located in the most secure section of Building 7, accessible only with special clearance codes that cleaning staff weren't supposed to possess. But Peterson had somehow arranged for my access card to work, and I slipped into the room 5 minutes before the appointed time. The conference room was small and windowless, designed for sensitive discussions that required complete privacy. A single table surrounded by 6 chairs, a secure phone system, and electronic jamming equipment that would prevent any surveillance devices from functioning properly. It was the kind of room where careers were made and broken, where decisions that affected national security were debated and finalized. Peterson arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, carrying a thick manila folder, and wearing an expression that mixed determination with something that might have been nervousness. He closed the door behind him and activated the room's security protocols, ensuring that our conversation would remain completely private. "Thank you for coming," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't," I admitted. "This feels dangerous for both of us." Peterson nodded soberly. "It is dangerous. What I'm about to propose could end my career if it goes wrong, and it could destroy any chance you have of returning to active duty if it's handled poorly. But I believe the potential benefits outweigh the risks." He opened the manila folder and spread its contents across the table. Photographs, personnel files, mission reports, organizational charts, a comprehensive intelligence package that painted a detailed picture of current SEAL operations and capabilities. "This is the current state of naval special warfare," Peterson said, his voice taking on the clinical tone of a briefing officer. "Recruitment is down. Retention is worse, and operational effectiveness is declining measurably. We're losing experienced personnel faster than we can replace them, and the quality of replacements isn't matching what we're losing." He pointed to a chart showing retention rates over the past 5 years. The trend line was unmistakably negative, with the steepest decline occurring in the category of senior enlisted and junior officers, the backbone of any special operations unit. The official explanation is that the operational tempo is too high, that people are burned out from repeated deployments. Peterson continued, "But when I interview people who are leaving, that's not what they tell me. They're leaving because they don't trust the leadership, because they feel their expertise isn't valued, because they believe the institution is more concerned with politics than with mission effectiveness." I studied the documents spread before me, recognizing patterns that confirmed my own observations from the past 3 years. Too many good people pushed out for the wrong reasons. Too many political appointees in positions that required operational experience. Too many decisions made by people who had never been shot at. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Peterson pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Chief of Naval Operations. 6 months ago, I was tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of personnel policies within naval special warfare. My mandate includes identifying systemic problems and recommending solutions, up to and including the reinstatement of personnel who were separated under questionable circumstances. Reinstatement. The word hung in the air between us like a promise and a threat. I had dreamed of this possibility during my first year as a janitor, had allowed myself to hope that someone would recognize the injustice of my separation and find a way to correct it. But after 4 years of cleaning toilets and emptying trash cans, the dream had faded into a dull ache of acceptance. "You're talking about bringing me back," I said quietly. "I'm talking about bringing back everyone who was pushed out for the wrong reasons." Peterson corrected. "You're not the only one, Sarah. There are dozens of experienced operators who were forced out due to political considerations, personality conflicts, or simple discrimination. The Navy needs their expertise, and they deserve a chance to serve again." He pulled out a list of names, some of which I recognized from my own service years. Martinez, who had been forced into early retirement after questioning a superior's tactical decision. Williams, who had been transferred to a non-operational position after reporting sexual harassment within his unit. Thompson, who had been medically separated despite being fully capable of continuing active duty. "How would this work?" I asked, scanning the list of familiar names. "You can't just wave a magic wand and reinstate people who have been out of the service for years." Peterson smiled grimly. "It's complicated but not impossible. The key is demonstrating that these personnel decisions were based on factors other than operational competence. If I can prove that capable people were removed for political reasons, I can make a case for their reinstatement based on current operational needs." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to the confidential tone used for sharing classified information. "I need help building that case. I need someone with inside knowledge of how these decisions were made, someone who understands the difference between official justifications and actual reasons. I need someone who has experienced the system from both sides." The implications of what he was suggesting began to dawn on me. He wasn't just offering me a chance to return to active duty, he was asking me to help expose the systemic problems that had led to my separation and the separation of others like me. It would require reliving the worst period of my life, confronting people who had betrayed my trust, and potentially making enemies of officers who still had the power to influence my future. "This isn't just about reinstatement," I said slowly. "You're talking about challenging the entire command structure that made these decisions." "I'm talking about fixing a broken system," Peterson replied firmly. "The current approach to personnel management in special operations is destroying the very thing it's supposed to protect. We can't continue losing good people because they don't fit someone's political agenda or personal prejudices." I stared at the documents spread across the table, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on my shoulders. For 4 years I had been invisible, powerless, existing on the margins of the world I once inhabited. Now Peterson was offering me a chance to step back into that world, but not as the junior officer who had been quietly pushed aside. He was asking me to return as someone who could influence real change, someone whose voice might actually matter, but it would come at a cost. Challenging the system that had expelled me would mean giving up the safe anonymity I had built, risking exposure to people who might still view me as a threat or an embarrassment. It would mean acknowledging publicly that I had been hiding, pretending to be someone I wasn't, living a lie for 4 years. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. Peterson nodded and began gathering up the documents. "I understand, but I need an answer soon. The window for this kind of systemic review doesn't stay open indefinitely, and there are people in the Pentagon who would prefer to keep these issues buried." He paused at the door, his hand on the security lock. "Sarah, I want you to know that I believe what happened to you was wrong. The Syria mission failed because of bad intelligence, not because of any deficiency in your leadership or capabilities. You were scapegoated because it was politically convenient, and that injustice has cost the Navy one of its most capable officers." After he left, I sat alone in the conference room for another 20 minutes, staring at the empty table and trying to process everything that had just happened. The secure walls seemed to press in around me, creating a cocoon of silence that amplified the sound of my own breathing and heartbeat. When I finally emerged from the conference room, the base felt different again. The corridors buzzed with conversations that suddenly seemed relevant to my future. The offices contained people who might someday be my colleagues again. The entire institution that had rejected me was being held up for examination, and I was being offered a chance to help determine what that examination would reveal. I finished my cleaning duties in a distracted haze, going through the familiar motions while my mind raced through the implications of Peterson's proposal. The other janitors noticed my distraction but attributed it to personal problems and left me alone. Even Maria, usually so attentive to the emotional states of her co-workers, simply patted my shoulder and told me that tomorrow would bring clearer thinking. The drive home took me past the beach where I sometimes went to watch the sunset and think about the direction of my life. Tonight, instead of going straight to my apartment, I pulled into the parking area and walked out onto the sand. The Pacific stretched endlessly westward, its surface reflecting the orange and pink light of the setting sun in patterns that shifted and changed with each wave. I had spent countless evenings here over the past 4 years, always alone, always wrestling with questions about identity and purpose, and the meaning of a life that felt suspended between who I had been and who I was becoming. Tonight felt different. Tonight I wasn't just contemplating my circumstances. I was facing a choice that could fundamentally alter everything about my future. Standing at the edge of the continent, watching waves that had traveled thousands of miles to reach this shore, I tried to imagine what it would feel like to return to active duty. To walk into a briefing room as Commander Chen instead of Sarah the janitor. To plan missions instead of cleaning up after them. To be responsible for the lives and safety of other people, instead of just for the cleanliness of their workspaces. The fear was overwhelming. 4 years of civilian life had softened some of the edges that military service had sharpened. 4 years of invisibility had made me comfortable with anonymity. 4 years of safety had made me forget what it felt like to carry the weight of command responsibility. Could I really step back into that world? Did I want to? But underneath the fear was something else, something that had been dormant but never completely extinguished. The sense of purpose that came from meaningful service. The satisfaction of using my skills and knowledge to protect others. The deep fulfillment that came from being part of something larger than myself. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a single word, "Remember." Attached to the message was a photograph I hadn't seen in years. It showed my old team after a successful mission in Afghanistan, all of us grinning at the camera with the exhausted satisfaction of people who had just accomplished something important. I was in the center of the group, my arm around Martinez's shoulders, my face bright with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you've made a difference in the world. I remembered that feeling, remembered what it was like to wake up each morning knowing that my work mattered, that my decisions could save lives, that my leadership could bring people home safely. I remembered the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction of meeting it successfully. I remembered who I had been before Syria, before the investigation, before the exile that had stripped away everything that had given my life meaning. Standing on that beach with the sun disappearing into the Pacific, I realized that I had been asking myself the wrong question. Instead of wondering whether I could return to active duty, I should have been asking whether I could continue to live without it. The answer came to me with the clarity of an order issued in combat. I couldn't continue this half-life of cleaning up after other people's important work. I couldn't remain invisible while people I had trained with struggled with problems I could help solve. I couldn't pretend to be content with safety when everything that mattered to me existed in the dangerous world of special operations. I typed a response to Peterson's text message. "I remember, and I'm ready." The reply came within minutes. "Good. Report to Building 7 tomorrow at 0600. Wear your dress uniform. It's time to stop hiding." Dress uniform. I hadn't worn my dress uniform in 4 years, hadn't even looked at it since the day I packed it away in the back of my closet like a shrine to a dead life. But it was still there, still pressed and ready. Still bearing the ribbons and insignia of a career that had meant everything to me. Tomorrow I would put it on again. Tomorrow I would walk into Building 7 as Commander Sarah Chen instead of Sarah the janitor. Tomorrow I would begin the process of reclaiming not just my military career but my identity as someone who had the courage to fight for what was right. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the shore, and I stood watching them until the last light faded from the western sky. Then I walked back to my car, drove to my apartment and began preparing for the most important mission of my life. My hands trembled as I pulled the dress uniform from the back of my closet at 5 o'clock in the morning. The navy blue fabric felt foreign against my fingers, heavier than I remembered, weighted with memories I had spent 4 years trying to forget. The ribbons caught the dim light from my bedside lamp, each one representing missions, commendations, moments of courage that had once defined who I was. Now they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The uniform still fit perfectly. 4 years of manual labor had kept me in better shape than most active duty personnel, and the precise measurements that had been taken during my final fitting remained accurate. But wearing it felt like putting on a costume, like playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. The woman in the mirror looked like Commander Sarah Chen, but I felt like an imposter pretending to be someone she had never really been. I arrived at Building 7 30 minutes early, parking in the visitors section because I no longer had access to the personnel parking areas. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the salt scent of the nearby ocean mixed with the diesel exhaust of military vehicles beginning their daily routines. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching familiar figures in camouflage uniforms walking purposefully toward their assignments, remembering what it felt like to be part of that organized urgency. At precisely 6 o'clock, I walked through the main entrance of Building 7 wearing my dress uniform and carrying the small briefcase Peterson had instructed me to bring. The security guard at the front desk did a double take when he saw me, clearly trying to reconcile the familiar face of Sarah the janitor with the unfamiliar sight of a female Navy commander. He checked his access list twice before issuing me a temporary badge that read Visitor Escort Required. Peterson was waiting for me in the main corridor, also in dress uniform, his ribbons and insignia marking him as someone with significantly more combat experience than most officers his age. He extended his hand for a formal handshake, and I noticed that several passing personnel stopped to stare at the unusual sight of two senior officers greeting each other in what was supposed to be an administrative building. "Commander Chen," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby listeners to hear my rank and name clearly. "Thank you for accepting this assignment. Admiral Morrison is waiting for us in the briefing room." Admiral Morrison. The name hit me like a physical blow. Rear Admiral James Morrison was the senior officer who had overseen my separation from the Navy 4 years ago. He had been the one to sign the final paperwork, the one to approve the medical discharge that had ended my career. The idea of facing him again, of sitting across a conference table from the man who had destroyed my life, filled me with a mixture of rage and terror that threatened to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. Peterson must have noticed my reaction because he placed a steadying hand on my elbow and leaned closer to speak in a voice only I could hear. "I know this is difficult. Morrison requested this meeting personally when he learned you were being considered for reinstatement. Whatever happened between you before, he wants to address it directly." We walked through corridors I had cleaned hundreds of times, but everything looked different from the perspective of someone wearing commander's insignia. Personnel who had walked past me without acknowledgement for 3 years now stepped aside respectfully, offering the courteous nods and brief greetings that military protocol demanded when encountering senior officers. I found myself automatically returning their salutes and acknowledgements, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The briefing room was larger than the conference room where Peterson and I had met the day before, designed to accommodate operational planning sessions and formal presentations. Admiral Morrison was already there, seated at the head of a polished oak table that reflected the overhead lights like a dark mirror. He stood when we entered, and I was struck by how much he had aged in 4 years. His hair had gone completely gray, deep lines bracketed his mouth and eyes, and he carried himself with the careful posture of someone dealing with chronic pain. "Commander Chen," he said, his voice neutral and professional, "please have a seat." I took the chair Peterson indicated, directly across from Morrison, and tried to keep my expression as neutral as his. The last time I had seen this man, he had been explaining to me why my military career was over, why the Navy could no longer afford to have me in uniform, why my continued presence would be detrimental to unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. Now he was sitting across from me as if we were colleagues discussing routine administrative matters. "I imagine you're wondering why I requested this meeting," Morrison began, opening a thick folder that contained what appeared to be my complete personnel file. 4 years ago, I made a decision that I believed was in the best interests of the Navy and of you personally. I've had considerable time to reflect on that decision, and I'm no longer certain it was the right one. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I had prepared myself for hostility, for justification, for bureaucratic doublespeak that would avoid any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I had not prepared myself for what sounded suspiciously like an apology from a flag officer who had never before shown any indication that he was capable of admitting error. The Syria operation was a tactical failure, he continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed these words carefully. 2 good men died, the mission objectives were not achieved, and the intelligence that led to the operation was fundamentally flawed. Those are facts that cannot be disputed. I felt my jaw tighten, and I had to consciously prevent myself from responding with the anger that had been building inside me for 4 years. Morrison noticed my reaction and held up a hand to forestall any comment I might make. However, he said, the investigation that followed clearly established that the tactical failure was not due to any deficiency in your command decisions, your leadership capabilities, or your professional competence. The mission failed because we sent you into a situation based on intelligence that was not just incomplete, but actively misleading. He pulled out a document I recognized as the final investigative report and slid it across the table toward me. Page 47 contains the classified assessment of your performance during the firefight that followed the initial contact. The investigating officers concluded that your tactical decisions were appropriate, your leadership was effective, and your efforts to minimize casualties were exemplary given the circumstances. I knew what was on page 47. I had read that assessment dozens of times during the weeks following my separation, using it as evidence that I had not failed as catastrophically as my nightmares suggested. But seeing it again, officially acknowledged by the officer who had ignored it when making his decision about my future, brought a flood of emotions I hadn't expected. If you knew this, I said, my voice barely controlled, why did you still force me out? Morrison closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, I saw something I had never seen from him before. Genuine regret, because I was a coward, because it was easier to sacrifice one officer than to confront a command structure that was looking for someone to blame, because I believed that protecting the institution was more important than protecting the people who served it. The honesty was brutal and unexpected. I had imagined this confrontation hundreds of times, had rehearsed angry speeches and demands for justice, but I had never considered the possibility that Morrison might actually acknowledge the injustice of what had been done to me. There were political pressures, he continued, his voice heavy with exhaustion, questions from Congress about women in combat roles, concerns from senior leadership about public perception, demands from the media for accountability after a high-profile mission failure. It would have been difficult to defend keeping you on active duty, even though that was what the evidence supported. Peterson leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had been expecting this conversation. Admiral, are you saying that Commander Chen was separated for political reasons rather than operational ones? I'm saying that Commander Chen was separated because I lacked the moral courage to do what was right instead of what was expedient. Morrison replied bluntly, and I'm saying that the Navy lost a valuable officer, because I was more concerned with my own career than with hers. The admission was devastating, in its completeness. For 4 years, I had wondered if I was delusional in believing that my separation had been unjust. I had questioned my own memories, doubted my own assessment of the Syria operation, considered the possibility that everyone else was right, and I was simply unable to accept responsibility for my failures. Now Morrison was confirming that my instincts had been correct, that I had been sacrificed for reasons that had nothing to do with my capabilities or performance. What happens now? I asked quietly. Morrison looked at Peterson, who nodded slightly before responding. Now we try to correct a mistake that should never have been made. Commander Peterson has been conducting a comprehensive review of personnel decisions within naval special warfare, and your case has become a focal point of that review. He pulled out another document, this one bearing official letterhead from the Chief of Naval Operations. This is a preliminary finding from the Personnel Review Board. Based on new evidence and a reassessment of the circumstances surrounding your separation, the board has concluded that you were separated under conditions that do not reflect your actual performance or potential for continued service. I stared at the document without really seeing it, trying to process the implications of what Morrison was telling me. Are you offering me reinstatement? We're offering you more than that, Peterson said, his voice carrying an excitement that had been absent from the conversation until now. We're offering you a chance to help rebuild the special operations community from the ground up. He opened his own briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents that dwarfed anything Morrison had shown me. Organizational charts, training protocols, operational assessments, personnel evaluations. It looked like a complete blueprint for restructuring how naval special warfare selected, trained and retained its personnel. The problems that led to your separation aren't unique to your case, Peterson explained, spreading the documents across the table. We've identified systematic issues with how the Navy handles personnel decisions in special operations, particularly decisions involving personnel who don't fit traditional molds. He pointed to a chart showing retention rates broken down by demographic categories. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Women, minorities, and personnel from non-traditional backgrounds were leaving special operations at rates significantly higher than their peers, often citing discrimination or lack of advancement opportunities. We're losing people we can't afford to lose, Peterson continued. People with skills, experience and perspectives that make special operations more effective. The Syria operation wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a larger problem with how we make decisions about who belongs in this community. Morrison nodded grimly. The current approach is unsustainable. We're facing recruitment challenges, retention problems, and declining operational effectiveness because we're prioritizing conformity over capability. I studied the documents spread before me, seeing patterns that confirmed observations I had made during my time as a janitor. The special operations community was becoming increasingly insular, increasingly resistant to change, increasingly willing to sacrifice competent personnel to maintain comfortable traditions. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Peterson's smile was the first genuine expression of enthusiasm I had seen from him since our initial meeting. We're proposing that you lead a task force to redesign personnel policies for naval special warfare. You would have the authority to review current practices, identify problematic policies, and recommend comprehensive reforms. The scope of what he was suggesting was breathtaking. Not just reinstatement to my former position, but promotion to a role that would allow me to influence the entire special operations community.
It was an opportunity to address not just my own case, but the systematic problems that had created situations like mine. There would be significant challenges, Morrison added, his tone becoming more serious. You would be working with personnel who were involved in your original separation, confronting institutional resistance to change, and dealing with political pressures that haven't diminished in the past 4 years. I thought about Lieutenant Jackson, who had treated me like his personal servant while I cleaned around his meetings. About Captain Morrison, who had made tactical errors that could have gotten people killed while dismissing the input of a janitor who knew better. About all the officers who had walked past me for 3 years without seeing the experienced commander who was hiding in plain sight. How many other people are we talking about? I asked. How many personnel have been separated under questionable circumstances? Peterson consulted one of his charts. In the past 5 years, we've identified 43 cases where experienced special operations personnel were separated for reasons that don't align with their performance evaluations or operational effectiveness ratings. 43 people, 43 careers destroyed, 43 lives disrupted, 43 examples of institutional failure that had cost the Navy irreplaceable experience and capability. The magnitude of the problem was staggering, and the opportunity to address it was equally overwhelming. What would be my authority? I asked. What resources would I have? Morrison answered this time, his voice carrying the weight of official authorization. You would be promoted to the rank of captain and given a direct reporting relationship to the Chief of Naval Operations. Your task force would have access to all personnel records, all operational assessments, and all policy documents related to special operations personnel management. Captain. The rank I had been working toward when my career was cut short, the position that would have given me the authority to influence policy at the highest levels. Now it was being offered as a tool to reform the system that had rejected me. Additionally, Peterson added, you would have the authority to recommend reinstatement for any personnel whose separations you determine were unjustified. The review board has already indicated their willingness to accept your recommendations in such cases. The power to correct injustices like my own, to bring back people who had been pushed out for the wrong reasons, to rebuild the special operations community around merit rather than politics. It was everything I had dreamed of during my darkest moments as a janitor, but it was also terrifying in its implications. I need to understand something, I said,
looking directly at Morrison. 4 years ago, you told me that my continued presence in the Navy would be detrimental to unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. What's changed? Morrison met my gaze without flinching. What's changed is that we can no longer afford to lose people like you. What's changed is that the problems we thought we could solve by removing troublesome personnel have only gotten worse. What's changed is that I've learned the difference between leadership and management, and I've realized that I failed at both when I approved your separation. His honesty was uncomfortable but necessary. I needed to know that this wasn't just an attempt to quietly correct an embarrassing mistake, but a genuine recognition that the entire approach to personnel management and special operations needed to be reformed. If I accept this position, I said slowly, I'll be working with people who were involved in pushing me out. I'll be reviewing the decisions of officers who may still believe I don't belong in special operations. I'll be challenging policies and procedures that have been in place for decades. Yes, Peterson said simply. That's exactly what we need you to do. I looked around the briefing room where I was sitting as a commander again, wearing the uniform I had thought I would never put on again, discussing opportunities I had believed were lost forever. 24 hours ago, I had been a janitor invisible to the very people who were now offering to make me one of the most powerful personnel officers in naval special warfare. The irony was almost overwhelming. The system that had rejected me was now asking me to fix itself, to use my experience as both an insider and an outsider to identify and correct the flaws that had led to my exile. It was an opportunity for justice, but it was also an opportunity for revenge, and I needed to be honest with myself about which motivation was stronger. I want to see the files, I said finally. All 43 cases. I want to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before I make any commitments. Morrison nodded and gestured to Peterson, who produced a secure tablet loaded with encrypted personnel files. These are preliminary assessments only, he cautioned. The detailed investigations would be part of your task force's responsibilities. I scrolled through the files, reading names and separation circumstances that painted a disturbing picture of systematic bias and institutional failure. Martinez, forced into early retirement for questioning a superior's tactical decisions. Williams, transferred to a non-operational position after reporting sexual harassment. Thompson, medically separated despite being cleared for continued duty by independent physicians. Each case represented a story like mine, capable personnel removed for reasons that had nothing to do with their operational effectiveness. Each separation had weakened the special operations community, removing experience and expertise that could not easily be replaced. But there were other cases too, personnel who had been separated for legitimate reasons, disciplinary problems, performance failures, medical conditions that genuinely compromised operational capability. The challenge would be distinguishing between justified separations and systematic discrimination, between necessary personnel actions and institutional failures. This will take months, I said, looking up from the tablet. Maybe years. We're talking about reviewing decades of personnel decisions, interviewing hundreds of people, challenging policies that have been established by multiple layers of command authority. Yes, Morrison agreed. It will be the most comprehensive review of special operations personnel management in the history of the Navy, and it needs to be done by someone who understands the system from multiple perspectives. Someone who had been both inside and outside, both commander and victim, both part of the institution and rejected by it. Someone who had spent 4 years invisible to the very people whose decisions she would now be reviewing. Someone who had learned to see the special operations community from angles that career officers never experienced. I thought about Maria, who had brought me sandwiches and worried about my well-being without knowing that I was a former Navy SEAL. About Tom, who had shared fishing stories and noticed my tactical sketches without understanding their significance. About all the enlisted personnel and junior officers who had walked past me for 3 years, never realizing that the janitor emptying their wastebaskets had more combat experience than most of their commanders. If I do this, I said, I do it completely. No political considerations, no protecting people's careers, no worrying about how the recommendations will be received by senior leadership. The mission is to fix the system, whatever that requires. Morrison and Peterson exchanged glances, and I could see them weighing the implications of giving me the kind of authority I was demanding. It would mean accepting recommendations that might embarrass current leadership, acknowledging mistakes that could have career consequences for flag officers, and implementing changes that would disrupt comfortable traditions. Agreed, Morrison said finally. Complete authority, complete independence, complete support from the highest levels of Navy leadership. I looked at the documents spread across the table, at the personnel files that represented so many disrupted careers, at the organizational charts that showed a community struggling with problems it had created for itself. The opportunity to make a real difference, to prevent future injustices, to rebuild special operations around principles of merit and capability rather than politics and conformity. When do I start? I asked. Peterson smiled and slid a final document across the table, promotion orders dated for the following Monday. You start as soon as you're ready, Captain Chen. Captain Chen. The title felt strange after 4 years of being called Sarah, or cleaning lady, or nothing at all. But it also felt right, like returning to an identity I had never really abandoned, just hidden under layers of necessity and survival. I signed the acceptance documents and shook hands with both officers, feeling the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders like a familiar uniform. As we prepared to leave the briefing room, Morrison stopped me with a hand on my arm. Sarah, he said, using my first name for the first time in our conversation, I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry for what happened 4 years ago. I made a decision based on fear and political calculation rather than justice and merit. I can't undo that mistake, but I can try to make sure it never happens again. The apology meant more than I had expected it to, not because it changed anything about the past 4 years, but because it acknowledged that those years had been unnecessary. That the exile and invisibility and loss of purpose had been avoidable consequences of institutional failure rather than personal inadequacy. Thank you, I said simply. But apologies don't bring back the time we lost or the people who were hurt. The only way to make this right is to ensure it doesn't happen to anyone else. As I walked out of Building 7, wearing my dress uniform and carrying promotion orders, I had never expected to see. I felt a complex mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. Relief at finally being vindicated, excitement about the opportunity to create meaningful change, apprehension about the challenges that lay ahead, and underneath it all, a deep satisfaction at the knowledge that I would no longer be invisible. The security guard who had checked me in that morning did a double take when he saw me leaving. Instead of the temporary visitor's badge, I now wore the identification of a newly promoted captain with special assignment authority. Instead of the uncertain posture of someone who wasn't sure she belonged, I carried myself with the confidence of someone who had just been given the power to reshape an entire institution. My phone buzzed with a text message from Peterson. Staff meeting tomorrow at 0800. Time to start building your task force. Building a task force. Selecting personnel who would help me review decades of questionable decisions, investigate systematic bias, and recommend comprehensive reforms. It would be the most important mission of my military career, more significant than any combat operation I had ever led. I drove home through neighborhoods that looked exactly the same as they had that morning, but everything felt different. I was no longer a former Navy SEAL working as a janitor. I was no longer invisible to the institution I had served for most of my adult life. I was no longer powerless to influence the system that had rejected me. I was Captain Sarah Chen, and I had work to do. The first staff meeting as Captain Chen felt like stepping into an alternate universe, where everything was familiar yet completely transformed. I sat at the head of a conference table in the same building where I had once mopped floors, wearing captain's insignia instead of a janitor's uniform. Surrounded by officers who had unknowingly walked past me for 3 years without recognizing one of the most experienced special operations commanders in the Navy. My task force consisted of 12 personnel carefully selected by Peterson and myself, 6 active duty officers with spotless records and reputations for integrity, 4 civilian analysts with expertise in organizational psychology and personnel management, and 2 retired senior enlisted personnel, whose decades of experience gave them unique perspectives on how policy decisions affected the operational community. What made the group particularly interesting was that none of them knew my full story yet. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez was the first to arrive, a sharp-eyed intelligence officer, whose personnel file indicated she had been questioning some of the same systematic problems I was tasked to investigate. She entered the conference room with the precise movements of someone accustomed to briefing senior officers, but I caught a flicker of surprise when she saw me sitting at the head of the table. "Captain Chen," she said, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "I've heard excellent things about your background in special operations, though I have to admit I wasn't familiar with your name before this assignment." The irony was delicious. Rodriguez had been one of the officers whose conversations I had overheard while cleaning her office, discussing intelligence failures and personnel mismanagement, with the kind of candor people only exhibited when they believed they weren't being observed by anyone important. She had no idea that the janitor who had emptied her wastebasket 3 times a week for the past year was now her commanding officer. The rest of the team assembled over the next 15 minutes, each introduction carrying its own undercurrent of recognition without realization. Commander Jackson, the young officer who had once snapped his fingers to get my attention as cleaning lady, now stood at attention while I reviewed his qualifications for the task force. Major Williams, a Marine Corps liaison whose office I had cleaned while he complained about Navy personnel policies, now listened respectfully as I outlined our mission objectives. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for me, and completely invisible to them.
They saw Captain Chen, a newly assigned officer with special authority from the Chief of Naval Operations. I saw people who had treated me as furniture for years, now hanging on my every word as if my opinions mattered more than anything else in their professional lives. "Our mission is comprehensive reform of naval special warfare personnel policies." I began, activating the secure briefing system and displaying the first slide of a presentation I had spent the weekend preparing. "We've been tasked with reviewing decades of personnel decisions, identifying systematic problems, and recommending fundamental changes to how we select, train, promote, and retain special operations personnel." The scope of our assignment was ambitious enough to generate murmurs of appreciation and concern from the assembled officers. Dr. Martinez, one of the civilian analysts, raised her hand with a question that went straight to the heart of our challenge. "Captain, are we looking at policy reform or personnel rehabilitation, because those are very different missions with very different success criteria?" It was an excellent question that deserved a complete answer. "We're looking at both," I replied. "Policy reform to prevent future injustices, and case review to address past ones. We have 43 specific cases where experienced personnel may have been separated for reasons unrelated to their operational effectiveness." I clicked to the next slide, which displayed a timeline of personnel separations over the past 5 years. The pattern was stark and undeniable. Experienced personnel were leaving special operations at unprecedented rates, often citing discrimination, lack of advancement opportunities, or conflicts with leadership that had nothing to do with their job performance. Commander Jackson leaned forward with interest. "Ma'am, do we have any indication of how much institutional knowledge we've lost through these separations? I mean in terms of training costs, operational experience, specialized skills." The question came from the same officer who had once dismissed me as cleaning lady while discussing important military matters. Now he was genuinely interested in my analysis of personnel management problems, completely unaware that he was talking to someone whose career had been destroyed by exactly the kind of institutional failures we were investigating. "Conservative estimates suggest we've lost over $20 million in training investments," I replied, clicking to a slide that displayed the stark financial costs of personnel turnover. "But the operational costs are harder to quantify. We're talking about decades of collective combat experience, institutional knowledge that can't be replaced by sending new personnel to schools, tactical expertise, developed through years of real-world operations." Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That would explain some of the operational effectiveness declines we've been seeing in recent assessments. You can't replace experience with enthusiasm, no matter how well-trained the replacements are." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from data collection methodologies, to interview protocols, to security procedures for handling sensitive personnel information. My team was competent, engaged, and genuinely committed to the mission of reform. They were also completely oblivious to the fact that their commanding officer was living proof of the systematic problems they were preparing to investigate. After the meeting ended and the conference room emptied, I remained behind to review the notes I had taken and plan our next steps.
The magnitude of what we were attempting was daunting, reviewing hundreds of personnel files, conducting interviews with dozens of separated personnel, analyzing policies that had been in place for decades, and making recommendations that could fundamentally change how naval special warfare managed its human resources. My secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Peterson, first case file attached. Recommend starting here. The attached file made my blood run cold. It was the complete personnel record of Master Chief Petty Officer Rebecca Torres, a Navy SEAL whose separation had occurred just 18 months ago, under circumstances that were eerily similar to my own. Torres had been a team leader with 12 years of distinguished service when a mission in Eastern Africa had gone wrong, resulting in casualties and a failed objective. Like my Syria operation, the Torres mission had failed due to faulty intelligence rather than tactical errors. Like my case, the investigating board had cleared Torres of any wrongdoing. Like my separation, Torres had been quietly pushed out of the service for reasons that had more to do with political convenience than operational necessity. But there were differences that made Torres's case even more troubling than my own. Torres was Latina, one of only a handful of Hispanic women to complete SEAL training. Her performance evaluations were exceptional, her leadership ratings were outstanding, and her specialty in explosive ordnance disposal made her irreplaceable in certain operational contexts. The Navy had invested over $1 million in her training and development, then discarded her because acknowledging her competence would have complicated the narrative about mission failure in Africa. I spent the rest of the day reading through Torres's file, cross-referencing her separation documents with the operational reports from her final mission. The pattern was depressingly familiar: a capable officer sacrificed to protect the careers and reputations of people who bore actual responsibility for strategic and tactical failures. The Torres case became my template for understanding how systematic discrimination operated within special operations. It wasn't overt hostility or conscious bias, though those certainly existed. It was the subtle process by which institutional convenience took precedence over individual justice, by which political considerations outweighed operational effectiveness, by which careers were destroyed to maintain comfortable narratives about who belonged in the special operations community. Over the following weeks, my task force developed into a remarkably effective investigative team. Rodriguez proved to be brilliant at analyzing personnel data and identifying statistical patterns that revealed bias in promotion and assignment decisions. Jackson, despite his previous dismissiveness toward support personnel, demonstrated genuine expertise in operational assessment and tactical evaluation. Dr. Martinez brought academic rigor to our analysis of organizational culture and decision-making processes. What made our work particularly effective was that none of them knew they were working for someone who had experienced the systematic problems we were investigating. Their analysis was objective and thorough, because they approached each case as an academic exercise rather than a personal crusade. They could see patterns and draw conclusions without being influenced by emotional investment in particular outcomes. But the emotional toll on me was enormous. Every case file we reviewed, every interview we conducted, every pattern of bias we identified, reminded me of my own experience and the years I had lost to institutional failure. I found myself reliving my separation, my exile, my transformation from commander to janitor, but now with the analytical tools to understand exactly how and why it had happened. The breakthrough came during our 4th week of investigation, when Rodriguez made a discovery that changed everything about our understanding of personnel management in special operations. She had been analyzing promotion rates and assignment patterns when she noticed something unusual in the data. "Captain," she said during our weekly briefing, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had uncovered a significant finding. "I think we're looking at more than just individual cases of bias or discrimination. I think we're looking at systematic manipulation of personnel records to support predetermined outcomes." She displayed a complex chart showing promotion timelines for officers who had been separated under questionable circumstances. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. In multiple cases, performance evaluations had been retroactively modified, training records had been altered, and disciplinary actions had been fabricated to justify separation decisions that had already been made for political reasons. "Are you saying that personnel records were falsified?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the sick feeling in my stomach. I'm saying that in at least 12 cases, personnel records show evidence of post hoc modification to support separation decisions, Rodriguez replied. Someone with high-level access to personnel databases has been systematically altering records to create justification for removing specific individuals from special operations. The implications were staggering. We weren't just dealing with biased decision-making or institutional discrimination. We were dealing with criminal misconduct at senior levels of Navy administration, fraud that had destroyed careers and weakened operational effectiveness while protecting the people responsible for systematic failures. Commander Jackson leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had just realized the scope of what we were investigating. Ma'am, if personnel records have been altered, that's not just a policy problem. That's conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, violation of federal records laws. We're talking about criminal charges for senior officers. I felt a mixture of vindication and rage that threatened to overwhelm my professional composure. For 4 years, I had wondered if I was imagining the injustice of my separation, if I was being paranoid about the circumstances that had led to my exile. Now we had evidence that my instincts had been correct, that my separation had been part of a broader pattern of criminal misconduct designed to protect careers and reputations at the expense of operational effectiveness. We need to expand our investigation, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. If records have been systematically altered, we need to identify all affected cases and determine the full scope of the falsification. Dr. Martinez raised a concern that went to the heart of our mission. Captain, if we're dealing with criminal misconduct at senior levels, we may be putting ourselves at risk by continuing this investigation. People who are willing to falsify official records might be willing to take other measures to protect themselves. The warning was sobering but not surprising. We had moved beyond personnel policy review into criminal investigation territory, and the people responsible for the misconduct we were uncovering had significant power and strong motivations to prevent exposure. Continuing our work would require courage and careful security procedures, but we had to continue. The evidence we were uncovering represented not just individual injustices, but systematic corruption that was undermining the integrity of naval special warfare. Every falsified record, every altered evaluation, every fabricated disciplinary action represented a betrayal of the principles that were supposed to govern military service. Over the next month, our investigation expanded dramatically. We identified 17 cases where personnel records showed clear evidence of post hoc modification, 32 cases where separation decisions appeared to be based on falsified documentation, and 8 cases where senior officers had clearly committed fraud to justify removing personnel who posed threats to their careers or reputations. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its consistency. Experienced personnel who questioned tactical decisions, reported misconduct, or simply represented inconvenient reminders of operational failures were systematically targeted for removal. Their records were altered to create justification, their reputations were destroyed through whisper campaigns, and their careers were ended to protect the people who bore actual responsibility for the problems they had identified. My own case was part of this pattern, but it was far from unique. The Syria operation had failed because of intelligence failures and strategic mistakes made by officers senior to me. But acknowledging those mistakes would have required admitting systematic problems with operational planning and risk assessment. It was easier to sacrifice me than to confront the institutional failures that had led to the mission's failure. The personal cost of this investigation was enormous. Every case file I reviewed, every pattern of misconduct I identified, every piece of evidence of systematic corruption reminded me of my own experience and the years of exile that could have been avoided if anyone had cared enough to investigate properly. I found myself working 16-hour days, driven by a combination of professional duty and personal rage that made it difficult to maintain the objectivity necessary for effective leadership. It was Rodriguez who finally confronted me about the toll the investigation was taking. She came to my office late one evening, when I was reviewing case files that should have been handled by junior analysts, working through details that didn't require captain-level attention, but that I couldn't delegate because they felt too personal. Captain, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk about how personally invested you are in this investigation. I looked up from the personnel file I had been studying, realizing that Rodriguez had noticed something I thought I had been concealing successfully. What do you mean? I mean that you're working like someone who has a personal stake in these outcomes, she replied bluntly. You know details about cases that aren't in the official files, you ask questions that suggest prior knowledge of circumstances that weren't documented, and you react to certain pieces of evidence like they confirm suspicions you already had. The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Despite my efforts to maintain professional objectivity, I had been approaching our investigation like someone seeking vindication rather than someone conducting impartial analysis. Rodriguez was too good an investigator not to notice the patterns in my behavior. Are you asking if I have personal experience with the kinds of problems we're investigating? I asked carefully. Rodriguez leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had been thinking about this question for weeks. Captain, I'm asking if you're one of the 43 cases we're supposed to be reviewing. The directness of the question caught me off guard. I had known this moment would come eventually, when someone on my team would recognize that my investment in our mission went beyond professional duty. But I hadn't expected it to happen so soon, and I hadn't expected it to come from Rodriguez. What makes you think that? I asked, stalling for time while I decided how much of my story to reveal. Because you know too much about how these separation processes work, Rodriguez replied. Because you understand the emotional impact on affected personnel in ways that suggest personal experience. Because you've been asking exactly the right questions to uncover exactly the kinds of evidence that would vindicate someone who had been wrongfully separated. She paused, studying my face with the analytical skills that made her such an effective intelligence officer. And because I finally figured out why your name seemed familiar when we first met. You're not Captain Chen, who was assigned to this task force from outside Naval Special Warfare.
You're Commander Chen, who was separated from SEAL Team 6 4 years ago, following the Syria operation. The recognition was both relief and terror. Relief because I no longer had to pretend to be someone I wasn't. Terror because revealing my identity would change everything about how my team perceived our mission and my leadership of it. Yes, I said simply. I'm one of the cases we're investigating. Rodriguez sat back in her chair, processing the implications of what I had just confirmed. That explains a lot about your approach to this investigation. It also creates some significant complications for our mission. She was right about the complications. Leading an investigation into my own case created obvious conflicts of interest and potential challenges to the credibility of our findings. If our recommendations were perceived as serving my personal interests rather than institutional needs, they could be dismissed regardless of their merit. But Rodriguez surprised me with her next comment. On the other hand, she said thoughtfully, it explains why you've been so effective at identifying patterns that other investigators might have missed. You're not just analyzing these cases academically. You understand exactly how the system works to destroy people who don't fit comfortable narratives. Over the next hour, I told Rodriguez the complete story of my separation, my exile, my transformation from Navy SEAL commander to janitor, and my recruitment by Peterson for this investigation. She listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes but mostly just absorbing the details of a story that gave context to everything we had been discovering about systematic misconduct in personnel management. When I finished, Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what she had learned. Finally, she looked up with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. Captain, what you've been through is exactly the kind of institutional failure we're supposed to be investigating, she said. But leading this investigation while being personally affected by the problems we're studying creates credibility challenges that could undermine everything we've accomplished. She was right, but there was more to consider than just credibility concerns. Rodriguez, the reason Peterson selected me for this mission is precisely because I have personal experience with these problems. I understand how the system works to remove people who don't fit, and I know what evidence to look for because I know how the process operates from the inside. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I understand that, and I think it's made our investigation more effective. But when we present our findings and recommendations, we're going to face questions about objectivity and personal motivation that could overshadow the merit of our analysis.
The conversation continued past midnight, covering everything from investigation methodology to presentation strategy to the personal and professional risks of revealing my background to the rest of the team. By the time Rodriguez left my office, we had developed a plan for managing the complications created by my personal involvement in the issues we were investigating. The next morning, I called a team meeting to address the questions that Rodriguez had raised and to provide context that would help my team understand both the scope of our mission and my qualifications for leading it. It was time to stop hiding behind my captain's insignia and acknowledge that I was more than just an outside investigator assigned to study problems I had never experienced personally. Before we proceed with the next phase of our investigation, I need to provide some additional context about my background and my connection to the issues we're studying. The room became completely still as my team realized they were about to learn something significant about their commanding officer. I could see curiosity, concern, and anticipation in their expressions as they waited for me to continue. 4 years ago, I was separated from naval special warfare following a mission failure in Syria, I said, watching their faces as they processed this information. The official reason was medical discharge due to post-traumatic stress. The actual reason was that I had become politically inconvenient following a high-profile operational failure. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. I could see my team members exchanging glances, recalibrating their understanding of who I was and why I had been selected for this mission. Commander Jackson looked particularly stunned, probably remembering conversations he had had about personnel problems while a certain janitor was cleaning his office. I spent the past 3 years working as custodial staff here at Point Loma, I continued, watching Jackson's face turn pale as he realized exactly who had been emptying his wastebasket and cleaning his office. I was recruited for this investigation by Commander Peterson because my experience as both victim and observer of systematic bias gave me unique insights into the problems we're studying. The revelation transformed the dynamics of our team in ways that were both positive and challenging. My credibility as someone who understood the personal impact of institutional failure was enhanced, but questions about objectivity and personal motivation became more complex. We spent the rest of that meeting discussing how my background affected our investigation and how we would address inevitable questions about bias and conflict of interest. But something else happened during that meeting that I hadn't expected. My team members began sharing their own experiences with institutional problems, their own observations of bias and discrimination, their own concerns about systematic failures in personnel management. Rodriguez talked about watching qualified women passed over for promotion in favor of less capable men. Jackson admitted that he had observed racial bias in assignment decisions but had never spoken up because he feared career consequences. By the end of that meeting, we weren't just an investigation team studying abstract personnel problems. We were a group of military professionals committed to fixing a system that had failed all of us in different ways. My personal experience with wrongful separation became a catalyst for broader discussions about institutional integrity and the courage required to confront systematic problems. That transformation in team dynamics marked the beginning of the most intensive phase of our investigation, when we moved from analyzing individual cases to understanding the full scope of systematic corruption within naval special warfare personnel management. We had evidence, we had methodology, we had commitment, and most importantly, we had the institutional authority to make recommendations that could create meaningful change. The real work was just beginning. 6 months later, I stood before a congressional committee wearing the uniform I had never expected to wear again, holding a briefing folder that contained evidence of systematic corruption spanning nearly a decade. The senators and representatives seated before me included some of the most powerful people in American government, but I felt no intimidation. After 4 years of invisibility and 6 months of uncovering criminal misconduct, I knew exactly what needed to be said. Senators, I began, my voice carrying across the packed hearing room, our investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic fraud, records falsification, and conspiracy to obstruct justice within naval special warfare personnel management. The room erupted in whispers and camera flashes. Behind me, Peterson sat with a satisfied expression that suggested he had been waiting years for this moment. In the gallery, I spotted Rodriguez, Jackson, and the rest of my task force, their faces showing the pride of people who had helped expose institutional corruption at the highest levels. Senator Williams leaned forward, her voice cutting through the noise. Captain Chen, are you testifying that senior Navy officials committed crimes to cover up their own failures? We have documented evidence that personnel records were systematically altered, performance evaluations were falsified, and careers were destroyed to protect officers who bore responsibility for operational failures. The evidence spoke for itself: 17 cases of proven records falsification, 32 wrongful separations based on fabricated documentation, 8 senior officers who had committed federal crimes to advance their careers. The financial cost exceeded $50 million in wasted training investments. The operational cost was incalculable. Admiral Morrison, now seated at the witness table beside me, provided his own testimony with the demeanor of someone who had accepted full responsibility for institutional failure. The systematic problems Captain Chen has identified represent the most serious breach of integrity in modern naval history, he said. These failures occurred on my watch, and I bear ultimate responsibility. The hearing continued for 3 days, with testimony from separated personnel, active duty whistleblowers, and civilian analysts. Torres flew in from Texas, where she had been working as a private security contractor, to describe how her career had been destroyed to protect incompetent leadership. Martinez testified about witnessing records alterations but remaining silent due to career concerns. One by one, the victims of systematic corruption told their stories to a nation that had never realized the extent of the problem. The media coverage was intense and sustained. Navy SEAL scandal rocks Pentagon dominated headlines for weeks. My photograph appeared on magazine covers with captions like "The Janitor Who Exposed Military Corruption" and "From Invisible to Unstoppable." The story captured public imagination in ways that transcended typical military news coverage. But the real satisfaction came from the institutional changes that followed. Within 90 days, Congress passed comprehensive personnel reform legislation. 8 senior officers faced criminal charges. 43 wrongfully separated personnel received reinstatement offers with full back pay and benefits. The entire special operations community underwent restructuring designed to prevent future abuses. Torres accepted her reinstatement and was promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer. Martinez returned as a lieutenant commander with assignment to Special Operations Training Command. Williams came back as a full commander with authority over equal opportunity programs. One by one, careers that had been destroyed for political convenience were restored with interest. The personal transformation was equally profound. I was promoted to Commodore and given command of the Special Operations Personnel Development Center, a new institution created specifically to prevent the kind of systematic discrimination we had exposed. My office overlooked the same waters where I had stood as a janitor, wondering if my exile would ever end. Maria, my former fellow janitor, attended my promotion ceremony wearing her finest dress and crying tears of joy she couldn't explain. "Mija," she said afterward, "I always knew you were something special. I just didn't know you were military royalty." Tom was there too, finally understanding why my lunch break sketches had looked like professional tactical diagrams. "Should have known," he said with characteristic understatement. "Nobody draws supply chain routes that look like assault plans." The most meaningful moment came during a private ceremony where I presented medals to task force members who had risked their careers to expose corruption. Rodriguez received a Navy Commendation Medal for her investigative excellence. Jackson got a letter of appreciation that acknowledged his growth from dismissive officer to committed reformer. Each team member had contributed to justice that extended far beyond individual cases. But perhaps the most important outcome was institutional. The special operations community that had once discarded experienced personnel for political convenience now actively recruited diverse talent and protected whistleblowers. Training programs emphasized integrity alongside tactical skills. Performance evaluations could no longer be altered without multiple approvals and permanent audit trails. Years later, when junior officers ask about the Great Reform, I tell them that institutional change requires people willing to risk everything for principles that matter more than personal comfort. Sometimes those people are senior leaders with obvious authority. Sometimes they're junior personnel with moral courage, and sometimes they're janitors who remember what it feels like to serve with honor. The Navy that rejected me learned that invisibility doesn't equal insignificance. The system that tried to erase me discovered that truth has a way of surfacing regardless of how deeply it's buried. Most importantly, the institution that valued conformity over competence learned that diversity of experience strengthens rather than weakens operational effectiveness. Standing in my current office, looking out at the ocean that witnessed both my exile and my vindication, I remember the words Peterson spoke during our first meeting. Sometimes the universe has a sense of timing that humans lack. The storm that stranded my former family wasn't just meteorological phenomenon, it was the beginning of justice that had been delayed but never denied. The janitor they never expected to matter had become the commander who changed everything. And that transformation proved that in America's military, merit eventually triumphs over politics, truth eventually conquers corruption, and people who serve with honor eventually find their way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.